There is a Chinese robot on Mars, and it's discovered some very strange and new things about the red planet. Like, is there life on Mars? China might have the answer. This is Zhurong. As far as rovers go, it's about medium-sized. Basically a copy of NASA's old Spirit and Opportunity vehicle from 2004, but it's still pretty impressive for a first attempt at landing on Mars. Zhuang launched as part of the Tianwen-1 mission in the year 2020. At the time, China had experience with 2 moon landings, so jumping straight to Mars was ambitious. Prior to that, only 3 space programs had ever successfully touched down on the red planet. The Soviet Union was first in 1971. Their Mars 3 lander reached the surface, deployed its instruments, sent back this one grainy picture of the Martian landscape, and then shut down, never to be heard from again. You might not know that the British landed on Mars in 2004 with a small probe named Beagle 2. Unfortunately, half of Beagle's solar panels got stuck in the process of deploying, and it was never able to power on. And then, of course, there's NASA. We know that they've been very successful with exploration of Mars since the first Viking lander in 1976 all the way up to the present day with their SUV-sized nuclear-powered vehicles and even a tiny helicopter that flew on Mars for the first time. So when the Chinese threw their hat in the ring, the odds were not in their favor. In an effort to maximize the chance of success, a landing site for Zhurong was chosen in the flat plains of the Utopia Planitia region. It's in the northern hemisphere of Mars, which is believed to have been covered in a large ocean several billion years ago. Meanwhile, NASA's Perseverance rover, also launched in 2020, was touching down in the nearby Jezero crater, a region littered with steep hills and ancient river valleys. Now, just because China's landing site was safe and flat, that does not mean it's boring. There's actually a long-forgotten secret hiding in the sands of Utopia Planitia that the Chinese may have come close to revealing. This is the same place where NASA's Viking 2 landed in '76, and it's where many people believe the Americans discovered life on Mars. But if they did, then they also immediately killed it by accident. This is not a story that you'll hear very often. According to the official record, no life has ever been found on Mars. But unofficially, scientists found something really weird in the Martian soil that Viking collected. Since this was our first ever up-close experience with Mars, people of the 1970s didn't know what they were going to find out there. But most of them were extremely confident that there would be alien life of some kind. So they devised an experiment, and this is an extremely simplified explanation of how it worked. They would scoop up some material from the surface and pull it inside the lander to study. Then they squirt the material with a little bit of water that had some nutrients mixed in. The idea was that any microbial life inside the soil would drink the water, consume the food, and then release CO2 as a byproduct. And what the experiment found was that the hydrated soil did produce CO2 gas. So, aliens confirmed, right? Well, part 2 of the experiment was to squirt more nutrient water into the same material a little later, with the idea being that the now thriving colony of bacteria would produce even more CO2. But that was not the case. It turned out the more water they added, the less CO2 was produced. This led NASA to conclude no aliens. But that has not stopped researchers from speculating over the years. If we are talking about a bacteria that has survived on Mars, an environment drier than the driest desert on Earth, then maybe it wasn't equipped to binge on nutrient-rich water. Maybe what we actually did was drown the aliens. At least they died well-fed. Either way, that's just to illustrate that there was always potential for China to find something incredible with their Mars rover, even if it wasn't out there rambling over mountain ranges. Zhurong was able to achieve a successful touchdown on the Martian surface using an old-school method. We've seen NASA get creative with some high-tech landing systems. They've used big inflatable balls to land rovers in the 90s and 2000s. Then they upgraded to these sky crane systems in more recent decades. All of this is necessary to achieve a soft landing with a heavy payload. But the Chinese rover is on the lighter side, so they chose a more simplified approach. A parachute slows the lander down as much as possible given the extremely thin air on Mars. And then once they get close enough to the surface, the parachute is cut away and a rocket engine fires up. This brings the vehicle down gently and shuts off just above the ground to let shock-absorbing legs handle the final touchdown. Same way that Viking landed 50 years ago, and it worked flawlessly for both. The lander extended a ramp down to the surface. Zhurong unfolded its solar panels and drove itself into the history books. the second space program to ever successfully deploy a robotic payload to Mars. The rover had a lot to do and only a short time to do it. The mission was initially given a 90-day lifespan. Due to the vehicle being solar-powered and the extremely prevalent dust storms on Mars, you know that eventually the dust will win. The Chinese rover has 3 main instruments to collect data. One is an array of different camera sensors to image the surface of Mars. The second is a laser that can break open the sample of rock to see what's inside. And the third is a ground-penetrating radar. And this is how China started finding some really interesting stuff on Mars. Deep below the windswept sandy surface, Zhurong started detecting layers of hydrated minerals. Over a stretch of about 1 mile, the ground-penetrating radar found 76 individual layers sitting between 10 and 35 and below the surface. And these layers were not flat. They all tipped at an angle pointing north towards the lands. So what Zhurong was sitting on top of was an ancient coastline with a structure very similar to coastal regions on Earth. The layers would have been created by water flowing down from the southern highlands into the northern ocean. And the depth of those layers suggests that this process was ongoing for tens of millions of years. Not only is that more evidence that Mars had water, but it's also a very strong indication that the surface of Mars was very wet and very active for a very long time. Long enough to produce life. Well, that kind of depends on how old this water actually is. Because life, as we know, it needs water, but it also needs time. A lot of time. Previous assumptions were made that water disappeared from Mars over 3 billion years ago. But what China found is casting doubt on that assumption. The deeper layers of hydrated material found by the ground-penetrating radar indicate a rapid flood around 3 billion years ago. So, it's possible that the first oceans of Mars did dry up for a few million years, maybe hundreds of millions of years, but then the water came back and then it dried up again. But it wasn't gone. The upper layers of hydrated material suggested another flood on Mars around 1.6 billion years ago. That's significantly more recent than anyone had really imagined. So we're now basically cutting the desert era of Mars in half. Meaning that at the same time microbial life was beginning to thrive in the oceans of Earth, there was water on Mars providing a similar environment. But this gets weirder. Zhurong continued to move through the desert and began to study these long, low-sand dunes on the surface. The dunes are about 30 m long and just 1 m high. So, it was easy enough for the robot to reach the top of the sand pile. And it found something very unusual. The dunes were covered in a very hard, crackly, salty crust that runs as deep as 8 centimeters into sand. Because of the notorious sandstorms, a crust like that would never have been able to form slowly over time. The wind would just blow it away. So, the most likely explanation had to be that liquid water had soaked the tops of these dunes, then evaporated away, leaving behind the hardened crust, kind of like a cement. The idea is that water vapor drifted down from the ice caps at the Martian North Pole. It then condensed and turned into snow that fell on the ancient ocean floor. That ocean left behind a lot of salt, which combined with the snow and allowed it to melt into liquid water that hydrated the outer layers of the surface. And indications from Chinese studies suggest that this might have happened as recently as 400,000 years ago. So at the same time that early humans and Neanderthals were roaming the surface of the Earth, there were snowstorms on Mars. So, what is going on here? Best we can tell, the polar regions of Mars, where the largest ice deposits are located, are probably going through periods of warming and cooling, and this creates seasons on Mars. And at least one of those seasons probably includes snow. But these changes in seasons are happening over incredibly long periods of time, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. Now, what is driving that change? It's most likely the result of small variations in the orbit and rotation of Mars. Something very similar happens to the Earth, and we call this process the Milankovitch cycles. They are governed by 3 major changes in the Earth's movement through space, all of which affect how much radiation we receive from the Sun. One is called eccentricity. That's variation in the shape of the Earth's orbit around the Sun. There's a slow transition between a near-circular orbit and a slightly oval-shaped orbit. This fluctuation happens over a period of about 100,000 years. 2 is axial tilt. The Earth spins on a slightly tilted angle that fluctuates between 22 and 24 degrees over a period of around 40,000 years. Higher levels of tilt produce more extreme seasons, and less tilt results in smaller variation between summer and winter. 3 is cold precession. This is a slow wobble that the Earth makes on its axis of rotation, kind of like a spinning top. This wobble happens over a period of around 26,000 years, and it affects the timing of the seasons like an early spring or late fall. We know a lot more about the Earth and its history than we do about Mars, so we can't say for sure that it goes through the same kind of cycles. But there's also no reason to say that it doesn't. And if it does, then there might be a perfect combination of orbit and rotation that warms the North Pole and causes it to release water vapor, which then blanket the northern hemisphere in snow that melts into water. And maybe once every billion years or so, that cycle releases enough water to flood the planet. Now, here's the wild speculation. In all of that wet, slushy soup of minerals, an alien microbe may have evolved to survive by slowly hydrating and dehydrating over millions of years. And we found it, but then we killed it because we didn't understand it, because we didn't understand Mars. As for the Zhurong rover, it survived much longer than its original 90-day mission, which is how most of this information was revealed. It continued on for 358 days of Mars exploration. In May 2022, the rover went into a planned shutdown to try and ride out a massive dust storm. The idea was that it might be able to power up again if the solar panels weren't too badly covered in dust. But we haven't heard from it since. This is not the end for China on Mars, though. It's only the beginning. In 2028, Chinese robots will return to the surface of Mars, but this time they'll come back, returning the first ever samples of Martian soil to the Earth. At that point, we'll finally get a really good look at this stuff, and maybe we'll find those aliens. And maybe we won't kill them this time. We probably will.